Imagine building one of the most recognizable brands in the world without a factory, without a huge marketing budget, and without even knowing whether your company would survive the next few months. Today, that company is Nike. But before the swoosh became a symbol of victory, its story was filled with debt, uncertainty, rejected ideas, and one enormous gamble. This is not really a story about shoes. It is the story of how a small American business turned struggle into a brand that would eventually be recognized almost everywhere on Earth. And it began with two people who had very different strengths, but one shared obsession: running. In the early 1960s, a young runner named Phil Knight had an unusual idea. Instead of trying to manufacture shoes in America, he believed high-quality athletic shoes could be produced in Japan and sold in the United States. At the time, this wasn't an obvious path to success. Knight wasn't a famous businessman. He wasn't sitting in a giant office surrounded by investors. He was a former middle-distance runner and a young man fascinated by a simple question: could better-designed running shoes help ordinary athletes perform better? That question eventually became the foundation of something much bigger. In 1964, Knight and his former track coach, Bill Bowerman, created a company called Blue Ribbon Sports. Knight invested money of his own. Bowerman brought something equally important: experience. As a coach, Bowerman was constantly looking for ways to make his athletes run better. He experimented with shoe designs, materials, and construction. To him, a running shoe wasn't simply something you wore, it was equipment. And if equipment could be improved even slightly, perhaps an athlete could improve too. The two men began importing Japanese running shoes and selling them in America. But there was one problem: they didn't have a giant store. They didn't have a massive advertising campaign. Knight often sold shoes directly to athletes, carrying boxes of footwear with him. It was a very small operation. But small businesses can hide enormous ambitions, and Knight had no intention of staying small forever. The shoes began attracting attention. More runners became interested. Sales increased. And strangely enough, success created a new problem. The company needed more shoes. More inventory meant more money. More sales meant more financing, and more growth meant greater pressure. Blue Ribbon Sports was becoming trapped between opportunity and cash flow. On paper, the business could look successful, but in reality, money was constantly moving in and out. Knight needed banks to believe in the company, and sometimes they didn't. There were moments when the business was dangerously close to running out of money. This is one of the least glamorous parts of entrepreneurship. People often imagine success as a straight line: idea, hard work, growth, wealth. Real businesses rarely work that way. Sometimes the hardest part isn't getting customers. It's surviving long enough to serve them. Knight kept going. But eventually, he realized that importing another company's shoes could only take the business so far. If they wanted complete control over their future, they needed something of their own, and that meant creating their own brand. In 1971, the company was preparing for a major transformation. It needed a new name, it needed a new identity, and most importantly, it needed a logo. A graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson was asked to create one. Knight wanted something simple, something that could suggest movement, something that would look good on the side of a shoe. Davidson came up with a curved checkmark-like symbol. Today, that symbol is known simply as the swoosh. But at the time, it wasn't treated like a priceless piece of corporate history. Knight reportedly wasn't immediately impressed. In fact, his reaction was famously uncertain. But the company needed a logo, so they used it. Davidson was paid $35 for the original design work. Think about that for a moment. One of the most recognizable symbols in modern business history began as a modest freelance design project. There was no billion-dollar brand behind it, no worldwide advertising campaign, no certainty that millions of people would ever recognize it. just a simple shape, and a company still trying to survive. The company also needed a new name. They eventually chose Nike. The name came from the ancient Greek goddess associated with victory, and that idea, victory, would become deeply connected to the brand. But Nike wasn't immediately the giant people know today. The company still faced competition, it still had financial pressure, and it still had to convince athletes that its products deserved a place on their feet. Then came an unexpected source of innovation. Bill Bowerman was constantly experimenting. One morning, while looking at a waffle iron, he had an idea. What if a shoe sole could be designed with a similar pattern to create traction while remaining lightweight? The idea led to the famous waffle sole. It was a small design breakthrough. But Nike's early story was built from exactly these kinds of small experiments. A coach noticing a problem. A designer trying a different shape. A businessman taking a financial risk. A company surviving one more difficult month. None of these moments looked historic while they were happening. Together, they were creating something historic. As Nike grew, Knight understood something important. A great product wasn't enough. People had to believe in the brand. Nike began connecting itself with athletes, not simply celebrities, competitors, people who trained when nobody was watching, people who understood pain, discipline, failure, and the desire to become better. This was powerful because Nike wasn't really selling the idea of a shoe, it was selling an identity. You weren't simply buying equipment, you were becoming part of a mindset, the mindset of the athlete who refuses to stop. And then came athletes who helped transform Nike's image. One of the most important was runner Steve Prefontaine. Prefontaine became closely associated with Nike during its early years and helped bring attention to the young brand. He represented something Nike would continue emphasizing for decades, the athlete as an individual. Not just someone wearing a product, someone chasing something, a record, a dream, a better version of themselves. And this is where Nike's story begins to become much larger than footwear. But while the brand was becoming stronger, the business itself remained under pressure. Nike's growth required money. Manufacturing required money. Inventory required money. Expansion required money. And banks weren't always willing to provide it. The company experienced serious financial difficulties during its early expansion. At times, the pressure became enormous. This is the part of Nike's story that is easy to forget when looking at the brand today. The company wasn't born powerful. It was fragile. Its future was uncertain. Every new order could create another financial problem. Every opportunity required another gamble. And every gamble could have gone wrong. Yet Knight continued pushing forward, because he believed the company wasn't simply selling shoes, he believed it was building a different kind of athletic brand. And eventually, that belief began paying off. During the 1970s, Nike expanded rapidly. The swoosh appeared on more shoes. Athletes began wearing the brand. Consumers started recognizing the name. The company moved beyond its original running shoe roots and expanded into a much broader athletic market. Then came one of the most important developments in Nike's history: basketball. The sport was exploding in popularity, and Nike saw an opportunity. A young basketball player named Michael Jordan would soon become one of the most important figures in the company's history. In 1984, Nike signed Jordan to a major endorsement deal. The result would eventually become the Air Jordan phenomenon. But there's an important lesson hidden here. Nike didn't become culturally powerful simply because it had good shoes. It understood something about storytelling. Jordan wasn't presented merely as someone wearing sneakers. He represented ambition, competition, confidence, excellence. The shoe became part of the story, and the story made people care about the shoe. That distinction would transform sports marketing forever.
By the 1980s, Nike was no longer simply competing against other athletic shoe companies. It was competing for attention. And then came an advertising campaign that would become one of the most recognizable phrases in modern marketing. Just do it. 3 words. Simple, direct, powerful. It didn't explain the technical specifications of a shoe. It didn't tell you how much the product weighed. It spoke to something deeper. The person who was afraid to start. The person who had failed.
The person who wanted to quit. The person who simply needed one more reason to keep moving. That message allowed Nike to reach beyond serious athletes. You didn't have to be a professional runner. You didn't have to play in a championship. You simply had to have something you wanted to accomplish. And suddenly, Nike wasn't just talking about sport. It was talking about human ambition. The swoosh became powerful not because the symbol itself was magical. It became powerful because millions of people slowly connected it with something. Movement, competition, victory, determination, and the belief that you could push beyond where you were yesterday. It's tempting to look at Nike today and think the lesson is build a great product and become famous. But that's not the real lesson. The deeper lesson is about persistence. Phil Knight didn't begin with certainty. Bill Bowerman didn't have a perfect blueprint. Carolyn Davidson didn't know that her simple design would become globally recognized. The early company didn't have unlimited money, and the future wasn't guaranteed. What they had was a willingness to keep improving. They tested ideas, they changed direction, they took risks. They survived problems, and they kept moving. That matters because most meaningful success doesn't arrive as one dramatic moment. It is usually built through hundreds of ordinary decisions. One more attempt, one more customer, one more design, one more difficult conversation, one more month of refusing to give up. The world eventually sees the result, but it rarely sees the struggle that created it. Today, the swoosh can be found almost everywhere. But perhaps its most interesting story isn't what it became, it's what it once was. A small idea, a struggling business, a simple logo, and a group of people who couldn't know whether their experiment would work. That's why the swoosh means more than a checkmark. It is a reminder that the things we now consider legendary often begin looking ordinary. Sometimes success doesn't announce itself when it arrives. Sometimes it looks like a risky decision made by someone who simply refuses to stop. And perhaps that's the real meaning behind Nike's most famous message. Keep moving, because you never know how far the next step might take you.